Hello, and thanks for tuning in to Ukraine Update from Compass Media, the only Irish source of balanced news and views from the NATO Ukraine-Russia war. I'm your host, Finbar Markey. This video is being published on the 23rd of August 2023. There's a lot of news happened over the last week, so let's get stuck in. We'll go to the battlefields first. And this is the map of the entire frontline battlefields in the Ukraine-Russia war at the moment. Although we report on a weekly basis about a village has been taken by the Ukrainians here and there, within a day or two, we're reporting that the Russians have taken those villages or those settlements back. And quite often these villages and these settlements are no more than heaps of rubble at this stage. After all the battles, they're depopulated, nobody lives in the area anymore, and these places are just rubble. The Ukrainians have advanced at the most 10 to 12 kilometers in one particular region near Bakhmut, but apart from that, they've advanced 1, 2, 3, 4 kilometers at the most in most areas. And for that, their losses have been very, very significant. Some are saying that between July and June of this year, so June, July, the first 2 months of the so-called Ukrainian summer counteroffensive, that they lost between 40 and 50,000 personnel and masses of mechanized vehicles, tanks, personnel carriers, all that kind of stuff, howitzer launchers. They've just lost so much for those small gains that are being promoted in Western media as significant advances. There is an acceptance within Western media at the moment that it is a lot slower than it had been planned to be. But there's still this element of positivity, which is pure propaganda and which is pulling the wool over the eyes of the people of the so-called West who are paying for this war and who are cheering it on because they're being told and provided with misinformation about it. If you look at this map, you'll see I've encircled 2 areas. The top of the front line, the north area of the front line, is in red. And that's where overall the Russians appear to be advancing. And this is the area that we're told has at least 100,000 Russian soldiers and, well, members of the Donetsk People's Republic's army as well. But overall Russian soldiers with up to 1,000 tanks in place as well. And they've been advancing around Kupiansk. And we'll look at that in a few minutes. Weeb Union came out with a report over the last few days suggesting that the Wagner forces that are in Belarus, which is further north in the area up here, that those Wagner forces may be prepared to enter across the Belarusian border in the Sumy region to enter into Ukraine as part of a major Russian advance, possibly in the autumn, to cut off the head of Ukraine, if you want to put it that way, so to divide Ukraine between the north and the south where their planned advance has been. Down further south, so the centre and the southern parts of the front line is encircled in blue, and that's where the Ukrainians have been constantly pounding with their counter-offensive and making little to no gains, and any gains that they make one day, they lose the next day. So overall, the situation is horrific for the Ukrainians and for the Russians as well. The Russians are losing a lot of personnel, nothing compared to what the Ukrainians are losing, but they still are losing personnel. They're losing machinery. They're using up a lot of missiles as well. But Ukraine is in a very unpleasant position. Now, there seems to have been a consensus developed over the last week, especially the last 3 to 4 days, that Ukraine is using its last 3 mechanized reserves in its so-called counter-offensive, particularly around the region of the village or the settlement of Robertina, which we'll look at also in a moment. But if this is the case, and it does seem to be more and more likely to be the case, that they're using up the last of their reserves, throwing them in this battle down south from Zaporizhia right up and past Artyomovsk, Bakhmut as it was called, right up to the Luhansk Oblast, the beginning of the Luhansk Oblast, and towards Kharkiv. So in that entire area, they're pushing in their reserves. And what happens after those reserves are used up, it's hard to tell. On the one hand, it may mean that some kind of a peace process begins, or a negotiation process formally begins and publicly begins and some kind of cessation of violence occurs. On the other hand, it may mean an escalation. It may mean that the build-up of Polish troops on the Polish border means something else. There's been a lot of talk of Poland and Ukraine entering into certain forms of alliances, including security alliances. And if this is the case, this could actually lead to an escalation. So when Ukraine uses up its final reserves, particularly these mechanized reserves, when they've used them up over the next 3, 4, 5 weeks, then we'll come to a pinnacle or a point where something has to give. And so I think we'll all be waiting with bated breath to find out what that is, because in reality, the future of the world rests on what happens over the next few weeks in Ukraine in terms of global peace into the near and medium term future. Just looking a little bit closer, although as I say, in a way there's no point, because it's just over and back every 24 hours. But just in terms of looking down south, this is the Zaporizhzhia region and Kherson. There are islands on the Dnieper River that the Ukrainians had captured. They're marked by an X here, and they had established footholds or bridgeheads on the eastern part of the river, which is the Russian-controlled part. But the Russians seem to have pushed them back. They're being bombarded on the islands again. Reports have come in that these bridgeheads or footholds that they established on the east bank of the Dnieper River, that the Ukrainians established, that they have lost those footholds. With regards to Bakhmut, we see that there are attacks by the Ukrainians in the north and south. Those attacks are being stalled by heavy artillery, by minefields, and by Russian resistance in general. In north, the Russians launched a kind of a small offensive over the last 48 hours. That offensive was eventually pushed back by the Ukrainians, and equally down south, the Ukrainians launched an offensive that was pushed back by the Russians. So again, no real move, but a lot of loss of life and a lot of loss of equipment on both sides, but particularly on the Ukrainian side. For every video that you see from the Ukrainian side of a destroyed Russian tank, you'll see a video of 5 or 10 destroyed Ukrainian tanks and personnel carriers in the one area. In the village of Robotyne, which has been the focus of fierce fighting and fierce battles, and where a lot of the reserves have been thrown in on the Ukrainian side, those final reserves, such as the 82nd Battalion. In this area, the Ukrainians appear to have taken a section of Robotyne. Reports coming in from the Russian side and from some independent sources and open sources that the Russians have pushed them back out of Robotyne. There's a massive loss of life, particularly in this area for this small settlement. South of Robotyne is the first real proper line of Russian fortifications that the Ukrainians haven't even reached yet, and it would appear that they have expended all of their forces just to advance to a point that hasn't even reached the first proper line of Russian defenses. And further north in the Lugansk Oblast and in the Kupiansk region, nearing Kupiansk, the Russian forces are advancing. They're creating a cauldron around Kupiansk. They're capturing small settlements around it, and it would appear that Kupiansk will fall over the next week or two, and then the advance is to Kharkiv after that. So the Russians are advancing, as we stated earlier in the report, in the northern regions. And if we are listen to commentators like Weeb Union, then the Russians are going to make a major advance in this area in the near future. In Donetsk city, over the last 4 to 5 days, reports have come out and video evidence has come out of the use of cluster bombs, US provided cluster munitions on the civilian population. We have a video from a reporter called Steve Sweeney, who's based in the Donetsk region. He's a UK reporter, and he just reported on the use of cluster munitions on the civilian population over the last few days. We'll have a look at this video. We'll come back in a minute.
This is the element of a cluster munition. As you can see, it's incredibly small, but it's done an enormous amount of damage. Here we can see the tiny holes in this, which appears to be part of the roof of the university building, which has come crashing down due to the cluster munitions. Now, there will be thousands of these particles released on impact, and as we saw last night, it's caused widespread devastation, a huge fire in this building. And again, we have to emphasize that these cluster munitions that are banned in more than 100 countries are being used in civilian areas. This is a civilian street just all around us, all around the university building. There are people's homes, there are apartments, there are shops where people go about their daily living. So this is not a military zone, this is not a military area, there are no military targets here. This is the use of cluster munitions against a civilian population.
So what has the cost been thus far for this counteroffensive, and beyond that, for the overall so-called defense of Ukraine? What has the cost been to Ukraine? Quite often when you cite the figures in the hundreds of thousands, you're told that you're just repeating Russian propaganda. But the New York Times last week covered a story in which it suggests that up to 500,000 soldiers on the Ukrainian side have been killed or wounded over the last 18 months. Troop deaths and injuries in Ukraine war near 500,000, US officials say. That's a massive figure. The suggestion from more independent sources has been that there has been up to 400,000, possibly 450,000 killed, and hundreds of more thousands of soldiers severely wounded, amputees, and people who will be scarred physically and mentally for the rest of their life because of this war. So is the reality that the actual figure is 400,000 dead? Because it was about 300 to 350,000 dead from independent reports and sources maybe 4 or 5 months ago. This is before the launch of the counteroffensive. The reports are that there has been between 40 and 50,000 Ukrainian soldiers killed during the counteroffensive, during the first 2 months, which is June and July. We mentioned that earlier. So trying to establish what the true figures are might be a little bit difficult because there are smaller line figures as well. But the bottom line is that there are hundreds of thousands of men being killed and wounded, at least 500,000 on the Ukrainian side, killed and or wounded in this war. And there's no advance, there's no change of position from either side. And at some point, negotiations really just have to happen. The Russian ambassador to the US, Andrei Kellen, has spoken to CNN and has expressed the Russian perspective of Ukraine's counteroffensive thus far. We'll have a look at this video. We'll be back in a wee minute.
Is this war going according to plan for the Kremlin?
First, you have mentioned the issue of a counteroffensive that has started from Ukrainian side. I reading final reports by British Ministry of Defense, which is still continue to say that they're moving. This is not correct. A couple of villages that has been taken by Ukrainian forces just 2 weeks ago, beginning of this month, has been retaken by the Russian forces. Losses that has been suffering Ukraine are terrible. It is 21,000 this month and 26,000 in June. Now Ukrainians are trying to attack our forward lines with only human power. They are saving tanks, including British tanks. I have never seen Challenger 2, by the way, on the field. So this is awful what is happening over there. And so they achieved nothing in this counteroffensive. And in contrary, Russian forces are now advancing in the north of Lugansk region. So that is a fact of life. So sooner or later, the government here also in the United Kingdom should recognize the truth. So this counteroffensive is not a success. Coming back to your issue of sending drones to the Russian civil buildings in Moscow, this is a terrorist attack because they deliberately targeted civilian buildings. Not much of a damage, I would say, not much of a fear, but it goes under any definition of terrorism.
Senate House Minority Leader, the Republican Party Minority Leader, Mitch McConnell, has made a statement to the Washington Post, or at least been reported in the Washington Post, as talking about the benefits of the Ukraine war from the point of view of the economy and jobs in the United States. Let's have a look at this headline. Okay, so Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell on Wednesday called for continued support for Ukraine during an event in Louisville, Kentucky. He pushed back on arguments that House Republicans and some Senate Republicans that Russian aggression in Ukraine is not an issue for the US. People think increasingly it appears that we shouldn't be doing this. Well, let me start by saying we haven't lost a single American in this war, McConnell said. Most of the money that we spend related to Ukraine is actually spent in the US, replenishing weapons, more modern weapons. So it's actually employing people here and improving our own military for what may lie ahead. So there's probably a few different misrepresentations and lies there. There's plenty of Americans being killed in this Ukraine war. They seem to just take off their US uniform, retire very, very early, join the Ukrainian army in one way or another, but still get paid by the American dollar through funds that are sent to Ukraine. So the idea that no Americans have been killed, well, that's certainly not true. I'd say it's pretty true, yeah, that they're making plenty of money and there's plenty of jobs being created in the United States vis-a-vis this war. But at what cost? Polish President Andrzej Duda has also spoken this week about the cost of this war, and he says that it's been pretty cheap for the United States so far. This is from the Washington Post. It's very simple, Polish President Andrzej Duda told me last week. Right now, Russian imperialism can be stopped cheaply because American soldiers are not dying. But if we don't put a halt to Russian aggression now, there will be a very high price to be paid. So according to Duda, it's been pretty cheap for the Americans, that the Americans have lost no soldiers so far. So this shows the mentality of the people that are driving this war forward. In terms of the hopes for the Ukrainian forces into the near and medium term future, there's a lot of retired US military personnel don't hold much hopes for what's going to happen, especially in terms of things like the delivery of Abrams tanks and how they will impact on the war. Here's a video of retired Major Lyons from the US Army giving his impression of how he thinks Abrams tanks will impact the hopes and the expectations of Ukraine's military into the near future.
The Abrams tanks are going to get there at a time when the rainy season is going to start. And the way tanks are deployed effectively is when they're used for shock effects. And if you're Russia, you're seeing where those tanks are going to go, because that's exactly where the offensive priority is going to be at that time. And what you'll do is you'll move troops there to counterbalance them. There's only 31 tanks or so showing up. They're not going to be that much of a difference maker. There's huge logistical tooth-to-tail ratio that goes with those tanks. Will they make a difference? They're going to allow more Ukrainian crews to survive, but those tanks still don't have any more capability to go through minefields or do other things. So, again, without the combined arms, without the air superiority, I think this is still going to remain a stalemate.
We also have a video from retired Colonel Wilkinson of the US Army, and he is speaking in an interview about how he perceives the rollout of the Ukrainian counter-offensive so far.
But it's a disaster. It's been a disaster since it started, and any military expert who is not paid by the media or isn't stupid knows that this is an uneven contest, even with NATO throwing everything it possibly can, except its own soldiers, into the battle, is a losing proposition for Ukraine. There's no way they can win. But unfortunately, that's a Pyrrhic thing for the Ukrainians, because what that morale did was give them expectations that were impossible. And now they're operating in a grinding offense against a defense, and they're being ground up. And they're going to continue to be ground up. And there's not too many more of them to be ground up. That's what you get when you have such an imbalance between the correlation of forces. On the one hand, you have one of the most robust industrial bases in the world. You have strategic depth that the Nazis couldn't even overcome, with one of the best armies on the face of the earth at the time. And you have the resilience that comes along with that, and the stubbornness that comes along with that. And you're trying to crack it, not with the Wehrmacht, not with the German war machine. You're trying to crack it with Ukraine, supported by NATO, without any real fundamental support on the battlefield in terms of soldiers, airplanes in the air, ships at sea, and so forth. So they're going to lose.
President Zelensky is reported to have cracked down on corruption within the conscription system and within conscription teams right across Ukraine, and has fired many members and leaders of conscription teams right across Ukraine. The actions have been taken in terms of alleged corruption, in which payments have been taken by conscription team members to allow people to flee across the border and to escape conscription and to escape being sent to the front lines. And this would appear to be impacting on the ability of Ukraine to mobilize and to get more cannon fodder, really, off to the front lines. Here's a headline from the Financial Times, I think it is. Ukraine cracks down on corrupt army recruiters. Thousands of men have avoided being drafted by paying for exemption papers. So I saw a speech by Zelensky on this particular issue in which he was talking about the need for patriotism and how terrible it is and how unloyal it is to put profit before doing your duty and conscripting these men, and also giving out about people running away and crossing the border to get away from conscription and from what would appear to be certain death on the front lines at the moment. And yet Seymour Hersh reported only a couple of months ago that Zelensky personally and his personal friends have benefited thus far from graft to the tune of $400 million in terms of funds that was supposed to go to fuel for the Ukrainian military from the United States and other countries, but that was actually graft. In other words, it was cream taken off the top for Zelensky and his friends. And yet Zelensky's condemning people for paying a few $100s, maybe a few $1,000s to escape certain death. There's a bit of an irony and a hypocrisy in that. It's almost weekly that we're being told by Western media and by Western politicians that Russian forces have committed another atrocity, have attacked a civilian piece of infrastructure, whether it's a hospital, a school, a library, a theatre. But we're not told what's inside that theatre. We're not told that it's been used by Ukrainian troops as positions and also as places to locate their troops. 2 more videos have emerged over the last week of Ukrainian troops using a kindergarten and a school as a military post or military base and firing from one of those posts as well.
Пацаны после работы, все спят. О, этот не спит. Чё ты не спишь? Ванька? Хайду иду. Блядь.
Where is this war going and how far might it expand? We are seeing destabilization right around the world in different flashpoints that can be directly or indirectly linked to this NATO-Ukraine-Russia war, whether it's Northwest Africa, Iraq, Syria, Poland, right around the world. And then we have the issue with the continued build-up of threat of war between China, the United States, and possibly even European countries. And again, due to the agitation, essentially, of the United States. So how far can this go? Well, in the North African situation, although the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov condemned the military coup or the junta that occurred in Niger, the Niger authorities now, the military junta, are exclaiming their support for Russia and are calling for Russian help. We know that Wagner are in the area, they're in Mali, they're in Burkina Faso, and they're possibly in Niger as well. So the ECOWAS have stated that they are on the verge of taking military action. They announced last week that they had directed their forces to prepare. Over the last 48 hours, the head of ECOWAS has said that they have set a date for when they're going to go in to Niger, but that they're not going to make that date public. But in terms of their claims so ECOWAS is a NATO-style coalition in Africa that is aligned essentially with the West. and is going to do the bidding of the West. And we're being told on the face of it that this is all about French need for uranium supplies from Niger. But I think it's probably a little bit more than that. We've been told by ECOWAS that this is about democracy. We're being told by NATO that this is about democracy. But it would appear that the people of Niger, the majority of them, are actually in favor of this military junta. There was a poll came out that went very public last week, suggesting that 70% of the people in Niger are actually in support of the principles and the policies of the Niger junta, as it's been called, the military coup, or what you might just call now the current government of Niger. This is a demonstration, a video from one of the most recent demonstrations in Niamey, the capital of Niger, in favor of the military junta. So we are being told that this is about uranium at the most. Well, we're being told it's about democracy, but then we're being told if you scrape the surface, you'll find out it's really about supplies of uranium to France. But it may be more than that. It may be about gas supplies to Europe that will replace Russian gas supplies. If we have a look at this map here, we see a planned pipeline that's in the making at the moment that goes from southern Nigeria, where the gas is actually extracted, right up through Nigeria, through Niger, through Algeria, up and into Europe. And we see the centrality and the importance of Niger cooperation in the development of this pipeline. So this is an international affair of great significance in terms of energy supply to Europe into the future. So it's more than just uranium being supplied to France. This is about the future plans to further isolate Russia through the provision of cheap gas from Nigeria. So the ECOWAS have said that they have planned set a date for military intervention into Niger. There are rumors that the Wagner military company, private military company, who are emplaced in the area, will support the Niger government in these matters. And although we are told that, Wagner PMC are a private entity and a private company, they have very, very strong links with the Russian government. So it will be interesting to see how things play out there. But that's just one flashpoint area around the globe in which there are more and more flashpoint areas, as I say, from Iraq to Iran to Syria to Poland to Taiwan, and building on a daily basis. Another area is actually Pakistan. And in Pakistan, Imran Khan, the Prime Minister, was deposed through a vote of no confidence over a year ago. This was done, many claim, including Imran Khan himself, on demands made by the US via emails, or what he calls ciphers, and we'll look at that in a little minute. Imran Khan was found guilty and was sentenced to at least 3 years in prison. He's got further charges being pressed against him currently. He's in prison at the moment. His chief aide, his second in command, who I think was also his vice prime minister, has been arrested over the last 48 hours and has been questioned as well. But Imran Khan was and is one of the most popular politicians and figures in Pakistan. So Pakistan, a nuclear power, is on a knife's edge. It would appear that the US has used blackmail, bribery, threats, whatever it can, to have Khan deposed. And the reason is that Khan refused to get involved in the squabble between NATO and Ukraine. He actually paid a visit to Moscow after the launch of the special military operation, as the Russian side call it. That visit had been planned long before the launch of the military operation, and Khan was just fulfilling an obligation. But that was used as a stick to beat him and to threaten Pakistan that there would be consequences from the US. Who knows what kind of consequences, whether they're military or otherwise, if the parliament members didn't vote to depose Khan. So that's what happened. So we're going to watch that space. It's a heavily populated country. It's a nuclear power, and it's very unstable at the moment. So we'll watch this space, and we can't see it outside of the wider context of what appears to be the slow, sloth-like movement forward of us towards some kind of a global conflict, because that's what seems to be developing slowly, but developing all the same. We have a video here of Imran Khan explaining, I think the video was made within the last 12 to 18 months, and he's explaining why he feels he was deposed.
Have you had any contact with U.S. authorities? Because the optics of your overthrow were that you were with Vladimir Putin as the response by Russia to NATO provocation, as Russia saw it, happened in Donbass. And there's been very little support for you from Washington. But on the other hand, you've tempered your initial charges that Washington was the sole conspirator of the coup that you allege.
When my government was removed, so just to give your viewers exactly what happened, a cipher, which is a correspondence from our ambassador in Washington, with his conversation with the American Undersecretary of State of South Asia. It was a recorded conversation in terms that there were note takers on both sides. So it was an official meeting.
This is Donald Lu, right? Antony Blinken's diplomat.
Yeah, so that correspondence, which is called the cipher, secret correspondence, arrived at the Foreign Office and at my desk. Now, what did it say? Donald Lu is telling the Pakistani ambassador that if you do not remove Imran Khan, your prime minister, in a vote of no confidence, there will be consequences for Pakistan. The next day, there's a vote of no confidence against me, a government that had the best economic performance in 17 years.
Bringing things closer to home, and the Irish government has announced that it is planning weapons training for Ukrainian troops into the near future. This comes as a surprise to many, as the Irish government already made a commitment to not involving itself in any form of lethal combat training in the past. This change of policy has been met with some protest. This was a recent protest outside of the Ministry for Foreign Affairs in Dublin. And finally tonight, Mick Wallace, the Irish MEP, has complained in the European Parliament about restrictions put on speaking time for MEPs who are opposed to the continued provision of arms and weapons to Ukraine.
President, on a point of order, you have always said that you respect the fact that people sit through the debate. I've been here since before it started, and you've let in a speaker that came in 10 minutes before he spoke. This, as far as we're concerned, you are censoring us. You are not allowing us to speak. I've been here before you were here. I was here before the debate started. Why won't you let me in, please?
That's all we have for this week's Ukraine update, folks. Thanks for tuning in. Like, share, subscribe where you can, and we'll see you next week.